The first thing I noticed after buying the house was that somebody had been living in my attic. Not recently. Not even within the last few months. There was just enough evidence to make me wonder how long they'd been there without anyone knowing. The house was in a quiet neighborhood outside Pittsburgh, and I bought it because it had everything I needed. 2 bedrooms, a finished basement, a detached garage, and the large attic that I planned to turn into an office. The realtor said the attic had never been finished because the previous owner didn't use it. That changed the first weekend I moved in. I was carrying boxes upstairs when I noticed a section of the attic floor that looked newer than the rest. The boards had been replaced in a rectangle about 6 feet long. I assumed it was an old repair. Then I noticed the screws. They were new. I crouched down and ran my hand over them. One of the boards moved slightly. I grabbed a screwdriver from my toolbox and removed it. Underneath was a narrow cavity between the floor joists. Inside was a single plastic storage container. There was no reason it should have been there. I pulled it out. Inside were dozens of photographs, not old family photos. Photographs of the house, the front door, the backyard, the garage, the hallway. Every picture had been taken from inside the property. Some were obviously taken before the previous owner renovated. One showed the living room with old furniture. Another showed the kitchen before the cabinets were replaced. Then I found one that made me stop. It showed my bedroom. The picture had been taken from the corner. The bed was still there. The walls were the same. Even the crack near the window was visible. The photograph had been taken from inside the house before I bought it. I checked the back. No date. No writing. Just a small black mark in the corner. I put everything back and told myself there had to be an innocent explanation. Maybe contractors had documented the renovations. Maybe the previous owner had stored the pictures. I called the realtor the next morning. She said she'd never seen the container. Then she asked me something strange. Was the attic floor open? I told her no. She went quiet. The seller specifically told us there was no storage up there. I asked her to come over. She said she couldn't until the following afternoon. That night I went back into the attic. I wanted to see whether I'd missed something. The storage container was gone. The hole in the floor was still there. The screws were scattered nearby. I searched the attic. Nothing. I called the police because at that point I was less worried about ghosts than I was about someone actually getting into my house. The officer checked every window and door, all locked. He inspected the attic. Nothing. He told me to call if anything else disappeared. The next morning, the container was back. It was sitting in the exact spot where I'd found it. I didn't touch it. I just took a photograph and left for work. When I came home, another photograph was sitting on the kitchen counter. I recognized the room immediately. My kitchen. The picture showed me standing there that morning, putting on my shoes. I wasn't looking at the camera. Which meant whoever took it had been standing behind me. I searched the house again. Nothing. That evening, I sat in my car outside for nearly an hour before finally going inside. I checked every room. Then I noticed the attic access door was open. I'd closed it. I went upstairs. The attic was dark. I turned on the light. There was a mattress on the floor. It hadn't been there earlier. It was old and stained, with a thin blanket folded on top. Beside it was a plastic water bottle. Half full. Fresh condensation on the outside. Someone had been there, recently. I backed out and called the police again. This time they searched the entire house from top to bottom. They found nothing. No hidden room. No person. No second entrance. One officer noticed the attic floorboards and asked if they had always looked that way. I told him no. He pried one up. Behind it was the same narrow cavity. But this time, it was empty. There were fresh scratches along the inside of the joists, like someone had been crawling through the space. He told me to stay somewhere else that night. I took his advice. The next day, I hired a locksmith to replace every lock. Then I installed cameras, one in the attic, one facing the back door, one in the hallway. I also put a small motion sensor on the attic ladder. That night, I stayed at a hotel. Around 3 in the morning, my phone vibrated. Motion detected. Attic. I opened the camera feed. At first I saw nothing. Then the image shifted. A man crawled into view from the far side of the attic. He was thin, barefoot, wearing dark clothes. He moved slowly across the floor and stopped beside the mattress. I zoomed in. He had his back toward the camera. Then he turned his head. He was wearing a mask. I called the police while watching him. The man remained completely still. Then he looked directly into the camera. He raised one finger to his lips and whispered something. The camera microphone picked it up. He's asleep. I stared at the screen. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't even inside the house. The police arrived within minutes. They entered the house. I watched their body cameras remotely through the security system. The attic was empty. The mattress was gone. The camera itself had been moved. Someone had turned it to face the wall. The officer searched again. Nothing. I stayed in a hotel for 3 nights. Then, because I couldn't afford to keep paying for it, I went back with a friend. We slept downstairs together. At around 2 in the morning, my friend woke me. He was staring toward the basement stairs. "What?" he whispered. "Did you hear that?" I listened. A soft tapping sound. Coming from above. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. My friend grabbed his phone. Then the tapping stopped. A minute later, my phone received a notification. Motion detected. Attic. My friend and I looked at each other. Neither of us moved. Then my phone buzzed again. Back door. Then another. Hallway. Then basement. The cameras were detecting movement throughout the house, but we were both sitting in the living room. The police came again. They searched the property. Nothing. My friend left before sunrise. I stayed. I couldn't explain why. Maybe I was angry. Maybe I didn't want to let whoever was doing this scare me out of my own home. The realtor finally returned my calls 2 days later. I asked her about the photographs. She admitted something she hadn't told me. The previous owner had complained about hearing someone walking around in the attic. He believed someone had been living there. The police had investigated. They never found anyone. Then, one morning, the previous owner discovered a sleeping bag in the attic. He threw it away. A week later, it came back. He eventually moved out. The house sat empty until I bought it. I asked why they hadn't disclosed that. She said the seller claimed there was no proof. That night, I went into the attic alone. I brought a camera, a flashlight, and a hammer. I knew it was stupid. I removed the repaired floorboards one by one. The cavity underneath was deeper than I expected. There was enough space for a person to crawl through. At the far end was another opening. It led behind the bedroom wall. I crawled closer. That's when I saw the second storage container. Inside were hundreds of photographs. Every previous owner. Every bedroom. Every kitchen. Every hallway. And then, my photographs. Not just recent ones. Pictures of me from before I bought the house. At the grocery store. At work. Getting into my car. Standing outside my apartment. Someone had been watching me before I ever saw the house listing. I dropped the camera. There was movement behind me. I turned. Nothing. Then I heard breathing from inside the wall. Slow. Close. A man's voice whispered my name. I crawled backward as fast as I could. I got out of the attic and ran outside. I never went back in. The police eventually found a narrow access route connecting my attic to an abandoned drainage space behind the neighboring properties. They couldn't identify whoever had been using it. I sold the house. The buyer demolished part of the attic during renovations. He sent me one message afterward. He said they'd found a small room behind the wall that wasn't on any building plans. He asked whether I knew about it. I said no. Then he sent me a photograph. The room contained a mattress, several empty water bottles, and a camera. The camera was aimed directly at the bedroom. But what scared me most wasn't the room. It was the wall beside the mattress. Someone had written a sentence there in black marker. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It said, "I only stopped watching because you moved." The first week in my new house, I kept finding the front door unlocked. I knew I wasn't forgetting. I had always locked my door twice before bed. It was something I'd done for years without thinking about it. But every morning, the deadbolt was turned back. At first, I blamed myself. Then I noticed something that made it impossible to ignore. The lock was being opened from the inside. I knew that because I started checking the position of the latch every night and taking a picture before going upstairs. I bought the house in a small town outside Buffalo after spending years in an apartment. It was an old 2-story place with a narrow front porch, a detached garage, and a basement that was basically just concrete walls and pipes. The previous owner had apparently lived there for more than 20 years. He died in a nursing home. The house had been empty for several months before I bought it. Nothing about the property seemed unusual. The first time the door was unlocked, I assumed I'd made a mistake. The second time, I wasn't sure. The third time, I started checking my phone photos every morning. The pattern became obvious. Every night, I locked the deadbolt. Every morning, it was unlocked. I called the realtor. She told me the lock had been replaced before closing. I asked whether anyone else had a key. She said no. I asked whether workers still had access. She said the house had been cleared before I moved in. I changed the deadbolt anyway. 2 days later, it happened again. That was when I decided to test it. I locked the front door and wedged a heavy chair beneath the handle from the inside. If someone entered, the chair would move. I also placed a strip of clear tape across the seam of the door so I'd know if it had opened. Then I went upstairs. The next morning, the tape was intact. The chair was still in place. The deadbolt was unlocked. I stood there staring at it for a long time. There was no way to open the door without moving the chair, yet the lock had been turned. I checked the other doors. All locked. The windows were locked. Nothing was missing. I started thinking maybe there was something wrong with the lock itself, so I bought a camera and pointed it directly at the front door. I left it running overnight. At 7 the next morning, I checked the footage. Everything looked normal. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, the video went black for 4 seconds. When it returned, the deadbolt was unlocked. Nothing else had changed. There was no person, no movement, no sound, just 4 missing seconds. I watched it again. Same thing. I checked the camera settings. No glitches. No corrupted file. The next night, I placed a second camera on the staircase. This time, I wanted to see whether someone was somehow coming downstairs. At 3:14, the front door camera went black again. The staircase camera stayed active. For those 4 seconds, nothing appeared on the stairs. No person, no movement. But when the front door footage returned, there was a shadow underneath it. From the outside, something was standing on the porch. I froze. The shadow remained for about 10 seconds. Then it disappeared. I didn't see anyone walk away. I didn't hear anything. I called the police. They checked the porch and the yard. Nothing. One officer asked whether I'd had any problems with the previous owner. I said I'd never met him. The officer exchanged a look with his partner. Then he asked if I knew about the basement. I told him there was nothing unusual down there. He said the previous owner had called police several times because he believed someone was entering through the basement. I asked whether they'd found anything. He said no. The last call had been about 2 years before the man's death. The officer looked toward the basement door. He said there was a second person living in the house. That sentence stayed in my head. The next weekend, I searched the basement. Behind the furnace was an old wooden cabinet. It was nailed shut. I pulled the nails out. Inside were stacks of paperwork. Most of it was useless. Receipts, utility bills, old repair invoices. Then I found a notebook. It belonged to the previous owner. Most of the pages were ordinary. Expenses, appointments, notes about the garden. Then the entries changed. He started writing down dates and times. 3:14, 3:14, 3:14. Every page had the same time. I kept reading. He wrote about the front door unlocking, the sound of footsteps, lights turning on downstairs, someone opening cabinets in the kitchen. Then one entry made my hands go cold. I know it isn't another person. It knows the house better than I do. Another page said, "It doesn't come through the doors." Another, "It only appears when everything is locked." Then, "It is learning the routine." The final page was almost unreadable. The handwriting became shaky. He had written, "I finally saw it." It was me. I stopped reading. For the first time, I considered leaving. Instead, I did something stupid. I decided to stay awake until 3:14. I wanted to see what happened. At 3:10, I was sitting on the couch with every light on. 3:12. 3:13. Then the clock changed. 3:14. The front door clicked. The deadbolt turned. I heard it clearly. Then the handle moved. But the chair I had placed beneath it did not move. The door was still closed. The handle turned again. Slowly. Then something whispered from the other side. My name. I stopped breathing. The voice sounded exactly like me. Not similar. Mine. It said, "You're supposed to be asleep." I didn't answer. The voice came again. "Open the door." I stayed still. Then there was a long pause. The voice changed. It sounded like my mother, then my brother, then a coworker, then back to me. Every voice was perfect. Finally, it said something that made my stomach drop. "You're making me wait longer this time." The front door stopped moving. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps on the porch. They walked around the house, then stopped beneath the living room window. I slowly turned my head. A figure was standing outside. I could see only the outline through the curtains. It was standing completely still. Then it raised one hand and waved. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom. The footsteps followed. They climbed the stairs, stopped outside my door. Then came two quiet knocks. I didn't answer. Another knock. Then silence. When daylight came, I opened the door. The hallway was empty. But there was a wet footprint on the floor. Just one. Bare human foot. I followed it downstairs. It ended at the front door. The lock was unlocked. I moved out that afternoon. I stayed with a friend for nearly a month while I put the house on the market. I didn't tell the buyer everything. I only said there were unexplained electrical and security issues. He bought it anyway. Several weeks later, I got a text from him. At first, I thought he was going to complain about the house. Instead, he sent me a picture. It showed his front door. The deadbolt was locked. A chair was wedged underneath the handle. Everything looked exactly like the setup I'd used. Then he sent another picture. It was a screenshot from his security camera, time-stamped 3:14 in the morning. The front door was still closed, but on the other side of it, someone was standing on the porch. The buyer wrote, "Do you know who this is?" I stared at the image for several seconds. Then I zoomed in. I recognized the clothes, the jacket, the shoes, the face. It was me, standing outside his house, smiling at the camera. The first night at my new house, I woke up because someone was moving furniture downstairs. I knew I lived alone. I also knew the house was empty when I went to bed. What I didn't know was that the noise had actually started 3 days before I moved in. I bought the house in a small town in Western Virginia after my landlord raised my rent for the second time. It wasn't anything special. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, detached garage, unfinished attic, small backyard. The previous owner had remodeled almost everything, and the price was low enough that I could finally stop renting. The realtor told me the house had been vacant for about 2 months. That mattered later. On moving day, I noticed something strange in the living room. There were faint rectangular marks on the hardwood floor. 4 of them. Like the legs of a heavy piece of furniture had been sitting there for years. But there was no furniture. I asked the realtor about it. She said the previous owner had taken everything with him. I didn't think much about it. That evening, I ordered pizza, put my mattress on the bedroom floor, and went to sleep around 11. A little after 2 in the morning, I woke up to a scraping sound. Clank-o, heavy. Something being dragged across hardwood. I sat up and listened. Scrape, heap, pause. Scrape. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone and walked downstairs. Nothing. The living room was empty. I checked the kitchen. Then the bathroom. Then the front door. Locked. I stood there for another minute, listening. Nothing. I went back upstairs. Before I could lie down, I heard the scraping again. This time it was directly below my bedroom. I went back downstairs. Still nothing. I thought maybe it was plumbing or something shifting in the walls. Old houses make strange noises. Mine wasn't even that old, but I was exhausted. The next morning, I noticed one of the rectangular marks on the floor looked darker. Like something had been sitting there recently. I ignored it. The second night, it happened again. Same time. Same sound, but this time there was something different. After the scraping stopped, I heard a chair being pulled out. Then silence. I stood at the top of the stairs with my phone flashlight pointed toward the living room. I could see the edge of a chair. It wasn't there before. I slowly walked downstairs. The chair was an old wooden dining chair. I didn't own it. I checked the entire house. Nothing else had changed. I took a picture of it because I wanted proof I wasn't imagining things. Then I called the realtor. She didn't answer. I put the chair in the garage. When I came back inside, it was gone. I searched the house again. Nothing. I started feeling stupid. Maybe I had moved it and forgotten. Maybe it had been left in the garage and I'd carried it inside without remembering. I was tired, stressed, still unpacking. There were plenty of explanations. That evening, I called a friend and asked him to stay over. I told him about the noises. He laughed at first. Then he saw the picture. "Where did you get that?" I told him. He stared at the screen. "That's a really old chair." I shrugged. "Okay, no, I mean really old." He zoomed in. There was a small metal plate underneath the seat. A number had been stamped into it. 7. My friend suggested I search the house's history. So the next day, I went to the county records office. The house had changed owners 6 times in 30 years. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that 3 of those owners had sold the property within 6 months. The clerk told me most records weren't digitized. She went into a back room and returned with a stack of old documents. One of them was a complaint filed by a previous owner. I read it twice. The complaint was about furniture, specifically furniture moving inside the house at night. The owner claimed a table, chairs, and a dresser had been found in different rooms despite nobody moving them. The county had sent an inspector. The inspector found nothing. The complaint was closed. I asked the clerk if there had been other reports. She looked through the stack. There are 4. The oldest one was from almost 20 years earlier. Same thing. Furniture appearing in different rooms. One report mentioned a chair. That chair had the same stamped number, 7. I stopped reading. I asked the clerk where the furniture came from. She shook her head. No idea. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed in the living room with every light on. At around 2 in the morning, the scraping started. I heard one chair, then another, then another. I froze. This wasn't one piece of furniture. Something was moving an entire dining set. I slowly walked toward the sound. It was coming from the kitchen. I could hear wooden legs dragging across the floor. Then, a plate breaking. Then another. Then something heavy being dropped. I reached the kitchen doorway. There was nothing there, but the smell changed. The room suddenly smelled like old cigarettes, and something else. Burned meat. I backed away. A second later, I heard a man's voice behind me. "You're late." I turned. Nobody. The voice had been close enough that I felt his breath on my neck. I ran upstairs, locked myself in my bedroom, and called 911. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. They searched every room. Nothing. One officer asked if anyone had been staying with me. I said no. He asked if I had taken medication. I told him no. He looked embarrassed. Then he said something that bothered me. "You're not the first person to call from this house." I asked what he meant. He wouldn't explain. After they left, I called my realtor again. This time she answered. I asked her directly if she knew about the previous complaints. She went silent. Then she said, "The previous owner asked me not to mention it." I asked why. She said the owner believed the furniture belonged to a family that had lived there decades earlier. What happened to them? She hesitated. There was a house fire. I asked if anyone died. She said 2 people. A man and his daughter. I asked how old the daughter was. She didn't know. Then she said something else. The fire started in the kitchen. That explained the smell. But not the furniture. I stopped staying there alone. For the next week, I slept at my friend's apartment. Eventually, I decided I needed proof. I installed 3 cameras inside the house. Living room. In a kitchen. Hallway. I left them running overnight. The next morning, I watched the footage. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 2:17 in the morning, the living room camera flickered. The image changed. The room was no longer empty. A dining table stood in the middle of it. 6 chairs surrounded it. I paused the video. The table wasn't there when I had gone to sleep. I kept watching. 1 chair moved backward. Slowly. Then another. Then all 6. Each chair pulled itself away from the table at exactly the same speed. Nobody was sitting in them. I switched to the kitchen camera. The kitchen was empty. Then a man walked into frame. He was wearing an old white shirt. His clothes looked burned. His face was turned away from the camera. He stood beside the table. Then he looked directly toward the camera. The video corrupted. When it came back, the man was gone, but someone else was sitting in one of the chairs. A little girl. I couldn't see her face. She had her back toward the camera. Then she slowly turned her head. The camera shut off. I never watched the rest. I sold the house 2 months later. I didn't tell the buyer everything. I told him there were strange noises. I told him the property had some history. That was all. He bought it anyway. A few months later, I received a message from him. He said he had found an old dining chair in the attic. He sent me a photograph. It was the same chair. Number 7. Then he asked me a question. Did you ever hear someone knocking from inside the walls? I didn't answer, because I had. I just never told anyone. 3 days after I moved out, I woke up in my new apartment at exactly 2:17 in the morning. I heard a chair scraping across the floor. I lived on the 4th floor. I had no dining room, no wooden furniture, no neighbors above me. The scraping continued. Then I heard a second chair, then a third. And finally, the sound of a little girl quietly pulling out a chair. Right beside my bed. The house had one window that I couldn't see from the inside. I noticed it the day I moved in. It was on the 2nd floor, facing the backyard, but there was no room behind it, at least not according to the floor plan. I bought the house at a small town outside Knoxville after my divorce. I wanted somewhere quiet where I could live alone and start over without spending a fortune. The house was old but well maintained, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a finished basement, and a long upstairs hallway with 3 bedrooms on one side and a bathroom at the end. No extra rooms. No strange additions. But from the backyard, you could clearly see a narrow window between the master bedroom and bathroom. It was tall and rectangular. I assumed it belonged to a closet or some kind of old storage space. During the inspection, I asked about it. The inspector looked at the window from outside and then at the floor plans. I don't see a room there. That was all he said. The realtor laughed it off. Probably an old architectural feature. I forgot about it for a while. The first strange thing happened 2 weeks after I moved in. I was mowing the backyard when I noticed the window was open. That was odd because I'd never opened it. I went upstairs and checked every room. The master bedroom window was closed. The bathroom window was closed. The wall between them was solid. There was no window. I walked back outside. The window was still there. Open. I could see white curtains moving behind it. I stood in the yard for almost 5 minutes trying to make sense of it. Then I heard someone close a window upstairs. I ran inside. The upstairs hallway was empty. I checked every room. Nothing. When I looked back outside, the window was gone. I didn't tell anyone. I assumed I was tired. A few nights later, I woke up around 2 in the morning because I heard someone walking upstairs. Slow footsteps. Bare feet on hardwood. I lived alone. The footsteps moved from the master bedroom toward the bathroom, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. I went upstairs and turned on the lights. Every room was empty. But the bathroom mirror was fogged. The shower hadn't been used. I wiped the mirror with my hand. Under the fog were 3 words. I can see you. I left the bathroom immediately. The next morning, the writing was gone. I started sleeping with the bedroom door locked. 3 days later, my neighbor stopped me while I was getting the mail. His name was Ray. He'd lived across the street for more than 20 years. He asked how I liked the house. I told him it was fine. Then I asked if he'd ever noticed a window upstairs that didn't appear on the floor plan. He went completely silent. Finally, he said, "Don't look into it." I laughed. "I'm serious." "So am I." He told me the previous owner had complained about the same thing. He'd see a window from outside. Sometimes there'd be someone standing behind it, but every time he went upstairs, there was nothing. Ray said the previous owner eventually covered the section of the exterior wall with plywood. The window disappeared. Then, months later, it came back. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. That night, I went into the backyard with a flashlight. The window was there again, closed. I walked closer. Someone was standing behind the glass. A woman. I couldn't see her face clearly. She was facing sideways. I called out, "Are you okay?" She slowly turned toward me. I stepped back. Her face looked completely normal, just pale. She lifted one hand and pointed toward the side of the house. I turned. Nothing. When I looked back, the window was gone. I went inside and called the police. They searched the house. Nothing. The officer suggested someone may have been reflecting in the glass from a neighboring property. I knew that wasn't possible. The window had no physical opening. It was on a wall that didn't contain any room. The next morning, I climbed into the attic. I wanted to see what was behind that section of the house. There was insulation, electrical wiring, and roof supports. No hidden room. No window. But there was one thing I hadn't noticed before. Someone had written something on one of the wooden beams. A name. Margaret. Underneath it was a date. Then another name. Another date. There were 7 names in total. The final one had no date. It was mine. I took pictures and climbed down. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office. I asked for the property's old permits. The clerk brought out a folder. One permit showed that a small extension had been added to the house decades earlier. But the extension was never completed. According to the permit, it was supposed to contain a bedroom. I asked what happened. The clerk searched through more records. Then she found something, a death certificate. A young woman named Margaret had died during the construction. The official cause was an accident. She'd fallen through an unfinished floor. The extension was never finished after that. The permit was abandoned. That should have been the end of it. But the house was later renovated. The builders apparently removed the extension completely. There was no physical trace of it, except the window. That night, I took a photograph of the backyard from my bedroom. The window wasn't there. I went to bed feeling relieved. At around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed. Motion detected. Backyard camera. I opened the feed. The window was back. This time it was open. Someone was standing behind it. I zoomed in. It was me, standing behind the glass, wearing the exact clothes I had on. I was staring directly into the camera. Then the figure raised one hand and knocked on the glass 3 times. My bedroom window rattled. I froze. Another 3 knocks. This time from inside my house. I ran downstairs. The front door was locked. Every window was closed. Then I heard knocking from the upstairs hallway. I grabbed a kitchen knife and climbed the stairs. The knocking came from the wall where the impossible window should have been. 3 slow knocks. I pressed my hand against the wall. The drywall was cold. Then something knocked back. I nearly fell down the stairs. I moved out the next morning. I didn't even sell the house immediately. I left it empty for several months while I stayed with family. Eventually, I found a buyer. Before closing, I went back one final time to remove some paperwork. As I stood in the driveway, I looked upstairs. The window was there. Open. The woman was standing behind it. This time I could see her face. She looked exactly like the photograph I had found in the county records. "Margaret," she smiled at me. Then she stepped backward into darkness. I sold the house and never returned. 6 months later, I received a text from the new owner. He said he'd noticed something strange. A window had appeared upstairs. I didn't answer. A second message arrived. He sent me a photograph. The impossible window was open. A woman stood behind it. And beside her was a man. I recognized him immediately. It was the new owner. He was standing with his face turned away from the glass. Margaret was looking directly at the camera, and between them, scratched into the inside of the window, were 2 words. Room ready. I knew the house had a problem when the previous owner left a note telling me not to use the basement freezer. That would have been strange enough on its own. What made it worse was that there was no basement freezer. I found the note on the kitchen counter the morning after I moved in. It was folded in half and written in black ink, "Do not use the freezer in the basement." That was it. No explanation. No signature. I had bought the house in a small town outside Denver, and the basement was unfinished except for a laundry area and a storage room. There was a large old freezer against one wall, but it wasn't plugged in. I assumed the note had been left behind by accident. I carried it downstairs and looked at the freezer. It was older than everything else in the house. White paint peeling, rust around the bottom. There was a padlock hanging from the handle. I didn't have a key. I left it alone. For the next week, nothing happened. Then one night, while doing laundry, I heard something knock from inside the freezer, just once. A dull thump. I froze. I knew it wasn't plugged in. I stepped closer. Another thump. Then silence. I called a friend and told him what I'd heard. He laughed and said it was probably metal expanding or shifting. That made sense. Until the next morning. The padlock was gone. I hadn't touched it. I checked every room looking for the key. Nothing. The freezer door was still closed. I didn't open it. Instead, I called the realtor. She sounded surprised when I mentioned the freezer. "I thought the seller removed that." "It's still here." She went quiet, then said she'd contact him. She called me back an hour later. "He says it wasn't his." I thought she was joking. "What do you mean?" "He says it was already there when he bought the house." I asked how long he'd owned it. She said 12 years. That meant nobody knew who the freezer belonged to. That evening I came home and found the basement light on. I always turned it off before leaving for work. I went downstairs. The freezer door was open about an inch. I stood there staring at it. Cold air wasn't coming out. The basement was actually warmer around it. I shut the door. Then I heard something scrape against the inside. I stepped backward. There were 3 slow sounds. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I ran upstairs and locked the basement door. I barely slept. The following afternoon, I opened the basement door. The freezer was still closed, but now there were wet footprints on the floor beside it. Bare feet. They started near the freezer and ended at the stairs. I called the police. 2 officers came and looked around. They checked the basement, then the yard, then all the doors and windows. One officer asked where I'd seen the footprints. I pointed. He stared at them for several seconds. Then he said, "Those are going the wrong way." I didn't understand. He pointed at the toes. "They're facing the freezer." He was right. The person had apparently walked backward from the stairs to the freezer. Then there were no prints leading away. The officers couldn't explain it. They suggested replacing the basement lock. I did. The next morning, the freezer was open. The lock on the basement door was still intact. Nothing had been disturbed except the freezer. I finally decided I was going to get rid of it. I called a junk removal company. 2 men came out that afternoon. They saw the freezer and asked whether it worked. I said no. One of them grabbed the handle. The freezer door opened. Both men immediately stopped. I couldn't see inside from where I stood. The first man looked at his partner. Then he quietly asked me, "Have you looked in this?" I said no. He shut the door. I wouldn't. I asked what they'd seen. Neither would answer. They carried the freezer out anyway, or tried to. It wouldn't move, not an inch. They pulled. They pushed. They used a dolly. Nothing. It was like it was anchored to the floor. They eventually left. I spent the entire evening trying to understand why I hadn't just thrown the thing away myself. Around midnight, I went downstairs with a flashlight. I decided I was opening it. Whatever was inside couldn't be worse than not knowing. I grabbed the handle. The door was already unlocked. I pulled. The inside was empty. Completely empty. No shelves. No motor, no coils. Nothing except a dark metal panel at the back. I leaned closer. There was a small circular hole in the center. Then I heard breathing from behind it. I jumped back so hard I hit the wall. The breathing continued. Slow. Steady. Someone was behind the freezer wall. I ran upstairs and called the police again. They arrived with more officers this time. One of them examined the freezer. Another checked the wall behind it. The wall sounded hollow. They opened a section of drywall. Behind it was a narrow concrete passage. The passage went back farther than the house itself should have allowed. One officer crawled inside. A few seconds later, he shouted, "There's another room." We all stared at each other. He came back carrying a plastic bag. Inside was an old wallet. The driver's license belonged to a man who had disappeared in the town more than 10 years earlier. The house had been built before he disappeared. The police spent the next several hours searching the hidden passage. They found clothing, old food containers, a mattress, a small radio, evidence that someone had been living down there. Recently, the mattress was still warm. I sold the house before the investigation finished. I never found out who had been using the passage. The police told me the access tunnel probably extended beneath the adjoining property, but they never located the other entrance. 2 months later, the detective handling the case called me. They'd found something else. A notebook. It contained dates going back years. Most of the pages were blank. But every few months, there was one sentence. Wait for new owner. That wasn't what frightened me. The final page had my closing date written at the top. Under it was a sentence dated the morning I moved in. He is upstairs now. I asked the detective who wrote it. He said they couldn't tell. The handwriting didn't match anyone they'd identified. I changed my phone number after that. I moved to another state. A year later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of my old basement. The freezer was back in its original place. The photograph had clearly been taken recently. Someone had written on the back, "The next one is already there." I stared at it for a long time. Then I noticed something in the picture I'd never seen before. The basement stairs were visible in the background, and standing halfway up them was someone watching the camera. It looked like me. The first thing I found in my new house was a set of footprints that stopped in the middle of the living room. They were muddy, fresh, and there was no second set leading into the house. I had been living there for 4 days when it happened. The house was in a rural part of western Pennsylvania, about 20 minutes outside a small town. It was an old 2-story place with a detached garage and a narrow strip of woods behind the property. I bought it because it was cheap and because I wanted privacy. There was one neighbor close enough to see from my kitchen window, but the house itself was far enough from the road that passing traffic barely made a sound. The previous owner had lived there for almost 20 years. According to the realtor, he moved into assisted living. Nothing unusual. The first few days were completely normal. Then it rained. A hard overnight storm. When I woke up the next morning, I noticed the back door was open about 3 inches. I immediately thought I'd forgotten to lock it. I walked over and shut it. That's when I saw the footprints. They started just inside the doorway. Bare feet, adult-sized. They crossed the mudroom, continued through the kitchen, and stopped in the center of the living room. No footprints led back toward the door. I stood there staring at them. The floor was dry everywhere else. Only the footprints were wet. I called the police. 2 officers came out and checked the property. Every window was locked. The back door showed no sign of being forced. They checked the garage and walked through the woods behind the house. Nothing. One officer suggested someone may have come in through the night and left through the front door. I pointed out that there were no footprints near the front door. He didn't have an answer. After they left, I cleaned the floor. I used bleach. I scrubbed until there was no trace left. That night, before bed, I locked every door. I also placed a chair underneath the back doorknob. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound from downstairs. Someone was walking across the kitchen floor, slow footsteps. I grabbed my phone and listened. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. Then silence. I called the police again. While I was talking to the dispatcher, I heard the back door creak. The chair scraped across the floor. Then the footsteps stopped. I didn't go downstairs. The officers arrived and searched the house. Again, nothing. But this time they found something. The same wet footprints, starting at the back door, ending in the living room. The exact same path. The officer looked at me. "You've had someone in here." "I know." He shook his head. "No, I mean someone came through recently." He pointed toward the living room. "The floor is still wet." I asked him how long the footprints could have been there. He said maybe 10 minutes. They had arrived less than 15 minutes after my call. That made no sense. The next morning I called the realtor. I asked whether the previous owner had ever reported someone entering the house. She hesitated, then said, "There were some concerns." "What kind?" "He believed someone was coming inside at night." I asked whether there had been evidence. She said the police had investigated several times. Nothing was ever found. Then she added something that made me uncomfortable. "He eventually stopped locking the back door." I asked why. She said he believed the person was already inside the house. That night I slept at a motel. The next morning I returned with my brother. We spent the day checking every inch of the property. We found nothing. My brother joked that I was letting the old owner's paranoia get to me. I almost believed him, until we went into the attic. There was a small section of floor near the far wall that looked like it had been repaired. My brother pried up the boards. Underneath was a narrow gap. Inside was a child's shoe. Old, covered in dried mud. There was only one. We also found a small spiral notebook. Most of the pages were blank. The first writing appeared near the middle. Someone had recorded dates and times, always early morning. 2:17, 2:31, 3:5. Then a sentence appeared on one page. "I hear him when he comes in." Another said, "He never leaves footprints outside." The final page read, "He sleeps where I sleep." My brother stopped making jokes. We called the police again. They took the notebook and the shoe. One of the officers asked if there had ever been children living in the house. The realtor's records showed the previous owner's wife had died about 15 years earlier. They had a daughter. She had disappeared when she was 12. No body was ever found. I asked whether the disappearance happened in the house. The officer said yes. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep there. I stayed with my brother. At around 1 in the morning, my phone received a security notification. I had installed one camera over the back door before leaving. Motion detected. I opened the feed. The camera showed my kitchen. At first, nothing. Then the back door slowly opened. A figure entered. I couldn't see the face. Just a person walking barefoot across the floor. The figure stopped in the living room, then turned toward the camera. It stood completely still. My brother watched beside me. He whispered, "Who is that?" I didn't answer. The figure lifted one hand and pointed toward the hallway. A second later, the camera feed went black. I called the police again. This time, one officer told me not to return to the house until morning. We went back at sunrise. The back door was locked. The house looked untouched. But there were footprints again. They started in the living room. They crossed the hallway, then climbed the stairs. Up to the second floor. My brother and I followed them. They continued down the hallway, past the bedrooms, straight into the master bedroom, and stopped beside the bed. There were no footprints on the other side, just a single wet impression beside where I had been sleeping. I sold the house 3 months later. The investigation into the girl's disappearance was reopened, but I never learned what happened. I moved to another state. For a long time, I thought that was the end. Then one rainy morning, almost 2 years later, I opened the front door of my new house and found muddy footprints on the porch, bare feet. One set. They stopped directly in front of the door. I checked the security camera. Nothing had been recorded. I cleaned them up and told myself there was a simple explanation. That evening, while I was making dinner, I noticed something on the kitchen floor. A single wet footprint. Then another. Then another. They crossed the kitchen, went through the hallway, and stopped beside the staircase. I stood there staring at them. Then I heard a small voice upstairs. A girl's voice. Very quiet. She said my name, and then she whispered, "He's still looking for me." The first night I slept in my new house, someone moved my car. I knew exactly where I'd parked it because I had backed it into the garage myself. When I woke up around 3 in the morning, I heard an engine start. I thought it was one of my new neighbors. Then I heard the garage door open. I got out of bed and looked through the upstairs window. My car was sitting in the driveway. The driver's door was open. I hadn't left it open. I grabbed my phone and ran downstairs. The front door was still locked. The alarm system hadn't gone off. I checked the garage. It was empty. My car was outside exactly where I'd seen it. I opened the driver's door. The keys were in the ignition. The engine was still warm. I stood there trying to understand what I was looking at. I had taken the keys out before going upstairs. I was absolutely certain. The following morning, I checked the security cameras. The camera facing the driveway showed something even stranger. At 2:58 in the morning, the garage door opened. My car slowly backed out. Then the garage door closed. For the next 30 seconds, the car sat in the driveway. Nobody got out. Then it drove away. I watched the footage several times. There was no driver visible through the windshield. I called the police. They came, checked the garage, and asked if anyone else had access to the house. I said no. They checked the car. Nothing was missing. One officer asked whether I'd recently moved from another house. I told him I'd bought this place 2 weeks earlier. He looked at the address on his notepad and asked, "Did the previous owner leave you anything unusual?" I said no. He paused. "You're sure?" I nodded. He didn't explain why he was asking. After they left, I called the realtor. She told me the previous owner had been a man named Robert who had lived there for almost 15 years. He had died unexpectedly. His family sold the house after clearing everything out. I asked whether he had ever had trouble with the garage. She said no. That night, I parked my car on the street instead. I removed the battery from the key fob. Then, I put the keys inside a metal box in my bedroom. I went to sleep. At exactly 3:12, I heard the garage door opening. I ran downstairs. The garage was empty. My car was still outside on the street. Then, I heard an engine, not my car. Something was running inside the garage. I opened the door. There was nothing there. The sound stopped immediately. I looked at the concrete floor. There were fresh tire marks. They went from the back wall to the garage door, but there wasn't enough space for another vehicle to fit. I called my brother. He came over the next afternoon. I showed him the camera footage. He watched it without saying anything. Then he asked me to replay the moment the car left. I did. He paused the video. Zoom in. I enlarged the windshield. There was a person's face behind the glass. I hadn't noticed it before. It was the previous owner, Robert. He was looking directly toward the camera. My brother asked me something that made my stomach tighten. How did he die? I called the realtor again. This time she admitted what she hadn't told me. Robert had been found dead in the garage. His car was running. The garage door was closed. Carbon monoxide poisoning. The family had assumed it was accidental. I asked whether anyone had ever questioned that. She said no. That night my brother stayed over. We slept downstairs. At around 2:40 in the morning, the garage door began opening again. We both heard it. My brother grabbed a flashlight. I grabbed a baseball bat. We walked into the garage together. The door was halfway open. Cold air was coming inside. My car wasn't there. I had parked it on the street. Then we heard the engine. It was coming from directly behind us. We turned around. My car was parked inside the garage. The headlights were on. The engine was running. The driver's door was open. My keys were still upstairs in the metal box. My brother whispered, "Don't get inside." We didn't. Instead, he called the police. While we waited, something strange happened. The radio turned on. It was tuned to an old country station. Static. Then a man's voice came through. Very faint. He said, "I couldn't get the door open." The transmission disappeared. My brother stared at me. Neither of us spoke. The police arrived and found the car exactly as we'd seen it. The engine was still running. They checked the garage. There was no one inside. One officer looked at the car's exhaust and frowned. He asked whether the vehicle had any mechanical problems. I said no. Then he pointed at the garage wall. There was a dark handprint beside the door. It looked like soot. The officer touched it. His glove came away black. I sold the house shortly afterward. I never told the buyer what happened. I only said I was moving for work. For several months, nothing happened. Then one afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A man introduced himself as the new homeowner. He said the house had been fine. He actually sounded happy. Then he asked me a strange question. Did the previous owner ever keep anything in the garage? I said I didn't know. He laughed nervously. "There's an old car in here." My heart dropped. "What kind?" He told me the make and model. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even close. He said it had been sitting behind a false wall they discovered during renovation. The car hadn't run in years. But there was something else. The driver's seat was wet. I asked him what he meant. He said it looked like someone had been sitting there recently. Then he sent me a photograph. The car was an older sedan. Dusty. Covered in cobwebs. But on the windshield, written from the inside in a single finger streak, were 4 words. I couldn't get out. I stared at the picture for a long time. Then I noticed the date on the photograph. It had been taken that morning, the exact same day he'd called me. That night, at my current house, I woke up to the sound of my garage door opening. I haven't owned that car in almost 3 years. But when I looked outside, my old car was sitting in the driveway. The driver's door was open, and the engine was already running.